Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County, where we believe that change is possible and you can make it happen. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is Pat Speer, who spent a lifetime working for social change. Born and raised in a working-class Irish Catholic family in the East End of Bridgeport, as a teenager he was prodded by the parish priest to get involved in outreach efforts. After graduating from Sacred Heart, he was Assistant Director of the Ministry of Social Concerns of the Bridgeport Catholic Diocese. Got an MA in Religion and Social Ethics from Boston University, then moved to Washington, where he was Program Officer at the Catholic Campaign for Human Development and Field Representative of the Youth Project. In 1988, Pat entered training in a professional organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation, which had been founded by Saul Alinsky. And then he returned to Connecticut and worked as an organizer for the United Mine Workers of America on their corporate campaign against the Pittston Company in Greenwich. From there, Pat became an organizer for a New Haven group of churches called Elm City Congregations Organized, or ECHO. And then in 2007 for a new organization called Connect, Congregations Organized for a New Connecticut. Connect had its formal launch last November, bringing together 26 churches, temples, and mosques from East Haven to Norwalk, working through their congregations for social change. Pat has recently resigned from Connect to concentrate on writing and coursework on the theology of organizing. Pat, welcome to Stream of Conscience.
Thank you, John. It's good to be here.
So you've spent a lifetime working either directly for social change as an organizer or supporting it with a variety of organizations.
I guess it comes to about 45 years at this point, but who's counting?
Who's counting?
That's right.
So clearly the church, the Catholic Church, your upbringing in the church has had a huge impact on your life and a major part of the direction. Can you talk about that?
I think that starts with family. I come from an immigrant family, 4 Irish grandparents. They all died within 5 years of each other in the influenza time. In
1918,
right
after the First World War.
And one grandmother, one great aunt, I should say, who raised both sides of the family in that a series of homes in the East End. So kind of a deeply rooted Catholicism in my family that took. And then I came of age in a parish / neighborhood that was going through profound changes, mostly racial. And I had the good fortune of having the priests in the parish all become quite involved in the world around them in the public square.
And what was that involvement like? I mean, we know how priests minister to congregations, but the involvement in the public square is not always so evident. Well,
it started off really just with charitable work. One of the priests arranged for Catholic Charities to come into the parish and do after-school programming and summer programming. But it was the 60s, so things were kind of political whether you chose them to be or not, and the priests did a lot of reading. They passed a lot of reading on to me. There were efforts involved in the neighborhood up on the main thoroughfare, Stratford Avenue, to have people organized to bring about more deeper changes in the neighborhood rather than just meeting the needs of individuals. So it was, a lot of it had to do with the times.
And what were some of the activities that you took part in, in that period when you were just coming of age?
Back as a youngin'?
Yes.
Boy, there was an attempt to have a community school in the neighborhood. There was an attempt to close the school that actually my mother graduated from. It was called Lincoln School, and it was an absolute fire trap. And the neighborhood organized with the Board of Ed at that time, brought them into the neighborhood and tried to show them the wisdom of closing it because it was a danger. And it actually, in the middle of that campaign, it burnt down in the middle of the night. So there were a couple of storefronts on Stratford Avenue, the Chessman Foundation and the Blessed Martin de Porres Center, that were providing services but also education for people in the neighborhood.
And what were you doing specifically?
I was a kid doing whatever either the priest or the mentors that I had on Stratford Avenue told me to do. So showing up at meetings, going around selling subscriptions to a community newspaper that we created called Harambe, a Swahili word for, I think, togetherness.
It was
testing
the 60s,
my memory here.
Wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
And at one point you went into a residential situation. And and did you not, and worked with other people in the community?
Residential?
Didn't you, weren't you involved? I thought you had told me at one time you had lived with some other people and were working for change in the community in Bridgeport.
No, just more that I never left the neighborhood, and there was so much going on in the neighborhood. There was a one-year period where I lived with a couple of other active Catholics out at a home in Fairfield that is long gone, called the Glen Mary House. This goes way back to the 1970s. Maybe that's what you mean.
Yes,
I don't know.
yes. Yeah. And what were you doing then?
We ran retreat weekends for young Catholic high school and college kids, and we ran orientation seminars, poverty seminars we call them, for the Fairfield County students who were going down to Appalachia for a week of service and stuff like that.
And when you moved to Washington later on, you actually were involved with Appalachia, weren't you, with the Catholic organizations you worked with in D.C.?
I was, for most of my years with the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which if people don't know is basically a foundation. It's a fund for domestic social change projects started by the Catholic bishops in 1970. And for most of my years there, I was the program officer, if you will, covering the southern states and the Appalachian Mountain states.
And what did you do in that regard?
That was 7 years of extraordinary learning, and we'd be here all day if I told you some of what I saw. We received proposals each year from organized groups of low-income people who wanted to bring about basic change. So there was no money for charity or service. The money was for actually the more controversial or provocative work of bringing about institutional change. So I was in on the first funding of an organization of textile workers, present and retired, called the Carolinas Brown Lung Association. And their fight was simple. They were dying of a disease called byssinosis that had been recognized and compensated in Great Britain for 40 years, and that in America, its existence was basically denied by the textile industry and the medical community. So they fought for and won recognition for the disease, and then spread their work to Alabama and Georgia and Virginia. So I spent a good number of weeks on the road in those years visiting projects in the Mississippi Delta, in farm worker country in south central Florida, where to this day there are slave-like conditions among the farm workers.
I've heard especially in the tomato crops.
Exactly, down around Immokalee.
Yeah. And so your work was in support of these people who were literally on the front line, organizing the poor and the dispossessed to gain some rights.
Right, work with all the Catholic dioceses to do the wheels of the funding cycle, but then also work with the projects providing advice and technical assistance along with the funding, and of course trying to find them more funding and support as well.
And then at one point, it seems like you decided to move from the support to the front lines yourself.
There was a great figure in organizing who was Saul Alinsky's hand-picked successor, and he's still alive. His name is Edward Chambers. And he kind of fulfilled the central casting version of the gruff organizer. And he's dropped a few one-liners on me in my life that was just the one line, that's it, and said to me outside of a church in the South Bronx one night going into an action with what a group that later became South Bronx Churches, introduced me to his wife as a funder with the youth project, and then turned to me and said, when are you going to stop being chaplain to the action and start doing the action yourself? So it was time to become a professional organizer after I was really moved by what I saw, by the success of it and kind of the miracles, what people accomplished with limited resources.
How old were you at that point?
Mid-20s into early 30s.
Okay.
For the Catholic bishop's work.
But when you decided to make the switch, when you decided to become an organizer yourself?
88, 40, 39 years old.
Wow. So really a mid-career complete change.
Yeah.
Or maybe not so much of a complete change, but a major shift in direction.
Smarter people do the opposite. They organize and get tired and go into foundation work. And
you did it the other way around.
I did it the other way around. Yeah.
So what was your training then to become an organizer?
I did, first off, had the great opportunity, this would have been in November of 1986, to attend the national training that the Industrial Areas Foundation does 3 or 4 times a year. At that time it was called 10-day training in Baltimore. And then in 1988 did 2 tryouts with them, 30 days each duration. One was in Baltimore with an organization of churches there, and the other was in Queens, New York. So that was a kind of an intensive experience to really get your feet wet and come to an understanding of what the day-to-day work is for a professional organizer.
And from there, then you moved to an action here in Connecticut.
Well, from there, my wife and I had pulled up stakes from the work in D.C. with the bishops. We wanted to come home, so we came home to Bridgeport, and I needed to find work where I could stay locally and raise my family. And an opportunity came up to join with the United Mine Workers of America. I still remember the phone call I got when someone said to me that the United Mine Workers of America were looking for an organizer to go to Greenwich. What? And
there's not a lot of coal mines in Greenwich.
Not a lot of coal mines in Greenwich, but an awful lot of powerful corporations. So,
yes. And what did you do there?
That was what they call a corporate campaign in the labor movement, which was the union was going up against the company because of its practices that were pretty dastardly, and had some sense that instead of just striking down in the hollers in the southwestern part of the state of Virginia, they wanted to kind of expand the pressure and the knowledge, and they wanted to have a presence in the town where the company was headquartered. So my job as an organizer was to help the leaders that came up from the mine workers every week, week in, week out, for a year, to go around and meet the press and clergy, churches, state their case, try to get people to understand what the issues were.
And after that, then you moved to New Haven.
I did. I was invited to New Haven to help see if there was appetite in New Haven to build a sponsoring committee. So in the kind of organizing that we do, it's possible to create an organization and launch it with power, with real money in the bank, with real people, only if the clergy in a faith-based organization want to take the time to get to know each other and decide whether they'll trust each other enough to put something on the table. So there was a few years of sponsoring committee work among some clergy in New Haven that led to the launching of an organization that was called Elm City Congregations Organized, or ECHO. So the preparation work was for 3 years. Its first public action was in, I think, May of 1993. And it ran for about 15 years in the public life of New Haven, made up of about 15 or 20 churches.
So that's very interesting, that the idea that it takes several years, in fact, to pull an organization together before it can even begin making, an attempt toward change.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that kind of experience? Because it seems, we're so, I think, attuned today to instant response. We want to go out and have a demonstration and tomorrow see that some law has gotten passed or someone's changed direction. And I think people don't understand the long-term requirement here of organizing to get
You raise
change.
a great question, and I think the way I think about it is that when you could be a person behind your front door watching TV, or a clergy person, when you're mobilized, someone is calling you or knocking on your door asking you to do something that person already knows what it is they want you to do. I'm here with a petition to re-elect the president or to abolish capital punishment in Connecticut. So we tend to latch on to an issue or a cause. And that's fine, and that's an important part of social change work, but it doesn't provide the opportunity for people to get to their own gut, their own story, their own passions and interests, and what they would like to do with those passions and interests, and whether they would like to aggregate them with other like-minded people. So that sponsoring committee phase, which could last a year but could last 4 or more, is critical, because the folks that are going to build the organizers don't build organizations. They train and help develop the leaders who build the organizations. So it's got to be real, and they've got to understand the ingredients that go into the building of it so that it's built on a firm foundation.
So in fact, what I think you're saying is that organizers are not in charge. They're helping others who will be in charge to have the skills and the support necessary to affect change.
Exactly. It's an interesting profession because you're not an executive director. You're not the boss. You've probably heard me mention, as we were getting to know each other, that I work for many bosses, but the 2 bosses, Pastor Bennett in Bridgeport and Reverend Manship in New Haven, are the co-chairs of Connect.
Right.
And so the organizer works for the leaders.
And you've just mentioned Connect, which is the more recent organization that you've helped pull together. Congregations organized for New Connecticut, right?
You got it.
Took me a while to remember that one.
Me too.
CONECT, only one N,
Right,
not two.
right.
And talk about that for a moment, because that's actually how I came to know about you and about the work that's going on here. 26 congregations of several different faiths,
Right.
from East Haven down to Norwalk.
To Norwalk.
And it had its public launch last November with 14,000 people in a very large church in Bridgeport.
1,400. Thanks for the compliment, and
1,400.
someday we'll get there. But
Hey,
actually, it was
thousand.
over 1,500. So yeah. You must be an organizer. You're cooking numbers. Yeah. Stop that.
Talk about that organization, how it came to be, where it's going.
I think there was a dual impulse. The first is that the folks who had formed and done ECHO realized that if we're going to have real long-term solutions to what I think, and a lot of people think, plagues Connecticut, which you might say is the two Connecticut's, almost the state of apartheid between the core urban areas and the outlying suburbs, that you wouldn't be able to do it with an organization called Elm City Congregations Organized. It would have to be more metro informed. And we would have to go out to meet the clergy in the suburbs to find out who they were, what their passions were. So at about the same time, the folks that had formed ECHO realized they needed to go out and see if they could enlarge it in the greater New Haven area. And then I was meeting with some clergy in the greater Bridgeport area to see if there was appetite and interest to create something in Bridgeport. So after a couple of day-long clergy retreats, they came up with the fairly wild idea in Connecticut of, let's create one organization, one sponsoring committee, and do this together. Bridgeport and New Haven are the first and third, I think, largest metro areas in the state. Let's see how much clout we could gather and how much we could get done.
And when did that process start? 2007, I think?
Yeah, the very initial meetings go as far back as 2007, just some meetings to seek out curiosity, stories, people's interests. And then I think they started to come together in late 2007, 2008 to meet and look at kind of the rudiments, the fundamentals to build an organization.
And what strikes me particularly about Connect is that the issues that the organization wants to work on haven't been decided in these meetings with the ministers and the rabbis and the imams, whoever was in the executive committee.
Right.
It seems that they had a series of house meetings and asked people in the various congregations, what are your problems? What issues do you think we need to work on? And
exactly.
Those have been brought up from below. Is that
yes, it goes back to the mobilizing versus organizing theme, and the Connect was launched through about a year and a half of our leaders holding what we call house meetings, and there were well over 300 of them in most of the member congregations, where 7, 8, 9, 10 people got together in each other's living rooms, or maybe in the church basement after services,
right,
to talk about what was keeping them up at night, what were the key pressures on their families. And it was out of that, and it will continue to be out of those encounters, that we'll hammer out an agenda for public life.
And I want to come back in another show to talk more about Connect, because I think it's a terrific organization with some very interesting possibilities.
Yeah.
But because your life has been so focused on organizing, you've lived this, and you've been through the Alinsky training, and you've worked to bring this to others. I actually wanted to talk a little bit about one of Saul Alinsky's books, which is called Rules for Radicals, and it's a classic. I think that a lot of people in the Tea Party actually are reading this book, not with the same idea that Saul Alinsky had, but well, one of the ideas, which is to organize people, but not for the same aims, for sure.
Certainly not around the values that Saul Alinsky
Not around the values
had.
of Saul Alinsky, and of course, he's been demonized in the campaign. Particularly Newt Gingrich speaks very ill will of him. But
well, the profession of organizer has been demonized.
this is true. That's true. But there is, in fact, in this book, Rules for Radicals, a section entitled The Education of an Organizer. And he has some points in here. I thought I would just pull out a few of these and ask you to think about and respond to them from your own experience.
I will. Is it pass-fail?
I
hope I do well.
There are no failing grades here. So he calls this a list of the ideal elements of an organizer, and the first thing he says that an organizer needs is curiosity. He says, the organizer becomes a carrier of the contagion of curiosity, for a people asking why are beginning to rebel. Curiosity, how has that been a part of what you've done?
Well, it did kill a cat, so there must be something dangerous about it. I like that for two reasons. One is that the base of curiosity, unless you're curious just about information, the basis of your curiosity is a love and an interest in other people. So for me, I grew up, when I look back, I grew up around a dining room table, often on Sunday evenings, with all the orphans that were raised together in my family talking, and there was never a need for a television or a radio or anything else, because there were stories and singing and good storytellers. And I would sit there as a young kid, mesmerized and wanting more. Tell me more. And so I resonate with that description by Alinsky. The why part is critical. And there was a great old archbishop in Recife, Brazil, Dom Helder Câmara, and they tried to give him the Nobel Peace Prize. They tried to give him everything. And he said, when I feed the hungry, they call me a saint, and when I ask them why they're hungry, they call me a communist. So the raising of the why contains a seed of provocation, I think.
The second one he has on here is irreverence.
Yeah.
And to the questioner, nothing is sacred. He detests dogma, defies any finite definition of morality, rebels against any repression of a free, open search for ideas, no matter where they may lead. He is challenging, insulting, agitating, discrediting. He stirs unrest.
Not too sure about the insulting, and I also wonder if we detest dogma or just test it. That's an important distinction. But he was the most reverent human being that I think I know.
Reverent or irreverent?
Reverent.
Reverent.
So there's got to be a base of a deeper reverence under that irreverence, and if not, you're just part of the late night TV cynicism and irony and that scene.
One of those that struck me is, and it took me a moment to understand this, is he says a bit of blurred vision for a better world. He says that for the organizer, the work is often repetitive and detail-oriented, and it's easy to get lost in the fact that you're one very small voice, one very small actor in a universe, but you need to be able to step back and say, I'm doing my work here, somebody else is doing their work there, and we have a vision altogether of a better world.
Yeah, well put, but I think that what he may mean by that at a deeper level is that the organizing, you won't organize for lasting gain and for a firm foundation if you're approaching people with some kind of firm ideology, no matter what it may be.
Right.
And I think an organizer, probably part of his or her DNA, is to not care what issues the leaders ultimately select, as long as they're within your moral compass, obviously, right? As long as they're willing to act on those issues.
And a free and open mind, a flexible personality, not a rigid structure that breaks when something unexpected happens.
That's probably a corollary of the way I just reacted to the blurred vision.
All new ideas arise from conflict. That every time man has had a new idea, it has been a challenge to the sacred ideas of the past and the present, and inevitably a conflict has emerged.
Yeah, I would say that our life is characterized by the tension between the world as it should be and the world as it is, and tension's required to act in any way. If you decide you're going to diet personally, you got to get off your butt and say, well, here's what I'm going to do tomorrow. You got to have a plan, right?
Right.
So out of that tension, it's almost impossible to get change without having the interests line up against you, and hence conflict is part of change.
And he does talk in the book about the organizer moving things to the point where with the group that you're working with, you're 100% right and the other side is 0% right in order to motivate your side to work very hard. But then at the end of the day, realizing that there's probably only a 10% difference that you're going to be able to work with and make a change around.
I don't know how people feel about that. I just have to say that in my lifelong experience that it's true. That in order to move, you've got to decide that this is enough. And the other force or guy is wrong. We've got to stop this. The first thing that ECHO did was close a package store across from a grammar school in New Haven, where for years vagrant men had assembled every day. And when we checked the records, in fact, the liquor store owner had called the cops many times. But it didn't change the fact that that was a bad place to have a package store in terms of public policy. Yeah. So it had to go. Nothing personal, but it had to go.
It had to go.
Yeah.
One last one here. And he's talking here about the difference between the leader and an organizer. The leader goes on to build power to fulfill his desires, to hold and wield the power for purposes both social and personal. He wants power himself. The organizer finds his goal in creation of power for others to use.
I suppose so. I think that I think that an organizer's dream and hope in helping leaders develop is that they would develop to be what we call primary leaders, which is not then the only difference between the job description is that the organizer gets paid. That the best leaders are really trying to develop others because they understand that's where their own fulfillment lies.
So leaders should be developing others as well as the organizer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've recently left Connect,
I
and
am.
you're going to be focusing on writing and about
trying not to starve.
Yes.
And B, it's time for me to put words to paper and develop a number of different ideas I have for books on the organizing process, but more importantly, kind of the theology, if you will, that undergirds it. And this is an important subject for me. And if I had not had the opportunity to organize with congregations these last 20 years, I don't think I would have been another kind of organizer, labor or tenant. It was the connection to the ethical traditions of the churches and synagogues and now mosques that appealed to me. And it's time for me to try to write that and teach it in a couple of different venues.
Well, we'd love to have you come back and talk more about that as you develop these ideas and get something down on paper.
Would love to.
Yeah, terrific. Pat, thanks so much for coming in
Thank
and
you,
sharing
John.
with us today.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all our shows on YouTube by going to youtube.com/user/DFATVnet. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. Or you can send comments or suggestions for a show to info@dfa-tv.net. If you'd like to learn more about progressive political action, we meet at 7 p.m. on the first Wednesday of the month at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We'd love to have you join us. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience, and I'm your host, John Hartwell. Thanks for watching.